Fortunately for me, a teacher saw this thing going on and stepped in, and that was the end of that. But that was the one and only fist fight I ever had. I came close to having another one with one of the kids that lived right next door to me, or 2 doors from me, Clarence Gilbert down on 4th Street. And he was a kind of a snotty type of guy, you know, and he was a good friend of mine. But he'd do some things that really get you mad, you know. And there's a guy that might take a nickel. He had less, it didn't bother him much to do something like that. But anyhow, I remember coming home from school one day. I can't remember what it was all about. But finally he just got my goat, and I just lost my temper. And I started after this guy, and actually I'd been afraid of him because he was a little bigger than I was. And I started after him, and he saw the expression on my face, and he turned and ran up on somebody's front porch. My only victory. But he didn't bother me anymore. It's surprising how they can learn their lesson. And another thing too, I felt so elated. You know, I'd taken that guy, you know, and that was a great feeling. That didn't happen often with me. But anyhow, at Davenport, Buchanan School, I went through 6th grade there, and I remember my fifth grade teacher, and I'll always remember. She was a red-haired lady by the name of Mrs. Culver. But she was, in my estimation, what every teacher should be. And every teacher can't, because she was perfect. She kept us all interested in what we were doing. She had a great interest. She had a great interest in each one of us individually. And she'd give everybody a chance to say something, you know, if they wanted to speak, and held their hand up, yes, and she'd treat them like on the same level as she was, you know. And she taught us not only schooling, but she was always giving us a little lesson on etiquette and honesty and various other things like that. And we got so, she was like a Bible to us, because we just appreciated everything she said. What a wonderful woman. That's one of the few that I had in my life that I'll never forget. But it was a fun time going through that stage from the 3rd to the 6th grade when I was there. And then I went to West Intermediate School, which was a middle school, they call it now. Those grades were from 7th through 9th, and then 10th you went to high school. And I had, we were taught spelling and penmanship in those days. This was by the same teacher in this one grade, which happened to be a short-tailed relation of ours called Anna Struve. She was a sister of the
Two
one
names,
that...
Anna Struve?
Anna was her first name. Struve was her last name. And she was a sister of now I can't think of her name. Hilda Struve, who gave me my name Victor Hugo, as a matter of fact. Mom, this is going back again, but anyhow, Mom had hoped for a girl. So she had dozens of girls' names, no boys' names. So anyhow, apparently, the only way I can gather is in this quandary of not being able to have a name or something, this Hilda come and visit her in the hospital. You know, well, back in those days, the women all spent 10 days in the hospital after a birth. And so during that period, she came there and wanted to know the name, and Mom says, I don't have one. And so she says, I have a name, Victor Hugo, and Hugo is my uncle Hugo Franzen. She says, I don't know what she said, but the story gets down to she didn't have any particular name for Victor or any reason for Victor, but Hugo was my uncle. So she came with Victor Hugo. How it happened, I don't know.
Was it from the author?
Well, the author, yeah. Well, the author carried some weight too because they were familiar with Victor Hugo, the author, and so that probably had something to do with it. But it didn't do any good for my writing abilities, I don't think, later on. But anyhow, Anna Struve taught spelling and penmanship, and she demanded that you keep your mind on your work, you know, don't talk, don't whisper, don't this, you know, the what am I trying to say? Everybody had to toe the mark, that's what I'm saying. What in the world is it? Strict. Strict is a good word, yeah. She was strict. But I, during that period, always liked to talk to somebody. And so I'd find myself talking to somebody like this or something, and she'd catch me at it. And she'd say, Victor, cut that out or something, whatever. And I got quite a few of those, and then one night I had to stay after school and write something on the board. That was one of the punishments in those days. I will not talk in class. Write it 100 times on the blackboard or something like that. And so anyhow, then the word gets home to my family, my mother and so forth, that I was naughty in Aunt Anna Struve's class. I never called her Aunt Ann in school, of course. And so I better straighten out. And so I knew that the word was getting home, that I'd had to stay after school for being naughty. But anyhow, she, like most of the teachers in those days, taught you something. You'd learn something. She learned how to spell pretty well. Back in those days, the language is taught by syllables. It's what's the term for that now?
Phonics?
Yeah. And it was much easier to learn. And it was taught not only to learn to speak it, but learn to spell it. And another thing too, everybody writes like this, but the teaching then, and it's good, and it's good just today, is that you rest and you don't move your fingers, you move your wrist. You write like this. And it's so much easier to do a good job writing like that, but I don't do it anymore either. It's an acquired type of writing. But once you acquired it, you can write beautifully. She wrote just beautifully, even on the blackboard. She'd go the big way rather than using the fingers. And so anyhow, that was one of my teachers in junior high school. What else can I tell you about that? I got interested in sports in a modest type of way. I never have been big on sports, but I went out for track. And later on in high school, I did it. I went out for track again and played a little football, but I wasn't very good at it. I played a little basketball too. And also, what sports I included YMCA. I was a member of the YMCA for 3 or 4 years. I really enjoyed that. We had a YMCA downtown, and the reason I got into it is because the YMCA was trying to get sponsors to sponsor poor kids and give them memberships in the YMCA. And I was one of the poor kids, and my sponsor was Dr. Siverud, who my Aunt Charlotte had worked for. My Aunt Charlotte told him about me, and so he said, fine, I'll put him in. So anyhow, he kept that up for me about 3 years, and I really appreciate it because I loved the YMCA. Learned how to swim. I became pretty good at swimming. I won some contests. But that's the only thing in sports that I ever acquired any technique at all. Now, I'm getting...
In in those years, in your junior high years, then you say you did a little sports, but so what was your after school activities then?
After school activities, what were they? Well, I think, I'm talking about school sports. I'd probably go home and we'd play baseball out in the sandlot or out in the pasture back at my grandmother's, and things like that. That's one thing we'd do, which is quite often we would play our own sandlot type baseball or football, whatever the season might be. But as going out for the team at high school and junior high school, I played basketball in junior high school, and I played a little football in high school, but I wasn't very good at it. I've never been, I don't have the coordination that's necessary to be a good athlete. I know that. I still don't have it. I play golf, but I'll never be good because I don't have the drive and the competitiveness in sports. My tendency is to say, well, if I'm not doing so well, so what, you know, instead of I'm going to get him, you know. I don't have that drive, that competitiveness. Not in sports, but I've had it all my life in other things, but not sports.
Well, then, so you did play sports a lot, but just with friends around the neighborhood.
That's right.
Things like that.
Yeah, and both on 4th Street and up at my grandmother's house on 13th Street, there were enough kids around that we could always get up a ball team. And in fact, we had a pretty darn good ball team. We called ourselves the Whippets, and we had no leagues. There was no organization. We would just get together, and so our gang was called the Whippets. Somebody else would be the Bulldogs or something. It'd be a gang of kids on the other side. And sometimes they just get a gang together to play, you know, just to compete. And so that's the way our baseball went. We did everything ourselves. The adults had nothing to do. Like now Little League, adults are the brains. The kids are simply the mechanism by which the game is played. But with us, we did everything. I mean, we made our own baseball diamonds, made our own backstops, and we worked to buy our own gloves. And unfortunately for us, though, we had one guy up on 13th Street there by my grandmother, Dick Knut, was one of the gang, and he had a wealthy family. He came from a wealthy family, and Harry Runge, his uncle, they had a very successful mortuary. So he had a lot of money, and always driving big cars. And so Dick, all he had to do was tell Uncle Harry that he needed a ball glove or he needed this or that. Uncle Harry provided it. Well, in time, Dick had provided half the team with gloves and balls and bats, you know, through Uncle Harry, you know. And so we were very thankful for him, and I was particularly because I was one of the poor kids, and so was Frank, of course, and there were others in the neighborhood. But anyhow, I'm glad we had that experience of we had to fight our own battles, have our own umpires. And we'd always have a squabble. Was he safe? Was he out? You know, and things like that. But we managed to arbitrate and play the game, you know, and it was a lot of fun. We really enjoyed it. And I really feel sorry for these kids today in these little leagues because they don't have that demand on their brains. Their parents are doing everything for them. And all the kids are doing is getting out and doing the physical part of it. So I'm glad for the days that I went through that.
Did you follow the professional sports leagues when you were
in interest?
That age, like in junior high age?
No, I never did too much. The only one, Uncle Ed Franzen, he was a pitcher for one of the semi-pro leagues. I don't think it was even pro. I think it was amateur, but they had uniforms. Somebody was sponsoring because they all had uniforms and everything else. And he's a pretty good pitcher, I guess, because they won a lot of games. But we followed up Uncle Ed wherever his team played and everything else. But as far yeah, we'd know about the Cubs in Chicago, Cubs and a few other teams around. The Chicago Cubs was the most favored team in Davenport because it was the closest one to us. Chicago was just 180 miles away, but St. Louis would be the next closest. That was over 200. So our interests always were with the Cubs and Chicago, you know. And also when football came in, Chicago side again, you know. And they still are. Yeah, the Davenport people are still big on Chicago. So, yeah, back in those days, we were aware that those teams existed and followed them to a degree, you know. And especially when they were in the playoffs, you know, the World Series and things like that. That's an interesting thing, too. Back in the days before radio and TV, of course, the newspaper was the only source of information. Well, you play a ball game on the World Series, for example, on Tuesday afternoon. That's too late for evening papers to publish. They can't even publish it. And so what they did, they put up a big baseball diamonds on the outside of their building. And it was like a triangle, or like a square, like a baseball diamonds, like this and everything. And they had guys up there that would move the ball around. They'd listen to it. They'd listen to it by phone, and find out what it was, and put the action on that big board. And here there'd be a whole crowd standing out, baseball fans standing out in the street there watching this thing. That was the crude way they got the message across of what was going on.
Where was that? In front of what building?
Well, they did that in front of the Democrat, the newspaper that I'd worked on later on. And on the Times too, the opposite. Both of them were owned by the same outfit, but the Times was one place and the Democrat was another. Two different.
So would they say the names of the players who were getting the hits?
Yeah, that's right. They'd put a card up. Who was up to bat? They'd put that card up, and then they'd take it down, put another card up. Yes.
They go pitch by pitch, or just batter by batter?
No, they wouldn't go pitch by pitch. It was whenever there was any movement. When a guy had made for a run for, I don't know whether they couldn't show how the ball where it went out. They'd have to. There was so much they couldn't do.
Right.
But nevertheless, there was some action up there, and we were advised of what the circumstances were at that game, you know,
right.
Who was winning. And so it drew a lot of people. And I remember when they first put that up there, boy, everybody in town wanted to see that. They thought it was great. We were satisfied with so much less in those days than they are today.
Oh, you had no choice.
No choice, and didn't know any better either.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did they only do that for World Series games, or did that start?
Yeah, I think it only was the World Series games, because it was the big awkward thing. It was right on the main street, and they had to block out part for people to stand in front of it, so the traffic had to kind of go around them. So they didn't do that too often. But the World Series was a big enough event that they would do it then.
And so they got actually blocked traffic by putting
Yeah,
that thing
right.
out there.
Yeah.
So people were interested. Obviously, people were really interested in baseball.
Yeah, yeah.
Was there? I don't know for sure. What was the interest in other professional sports compared to baseball?
Well, baseball was by far the most important game because everybody played baseball. The kids played baseball. Then when they grew up, and the high school had baseball, high school teams playing against each other. And then after you get a little bit older, then you get into one of these leagues my Uncle Ed was in, you know. And if you weren't playing baseball, you were out pitching it, plowing it back and forth with a friend of yours, you know. And baseball was big. And, well, of course, we played baseball right from scratch when we were, well, I guess we started playing baseball when we were 8 or 9 years old. Football we started playing when we were about 4 or 5 years older than that. So, furthermore, there wasn't football. There wasn't even the college universities. You see, the thing is, we had no radio. Radio came in and started handling these games probably about 1927 or 1928. So prior to that, we don't have knowledge of these teams. So the teams don't have that great. See, now somebody playing, we can all over the country we can hear about it. You know, and. So I think they played football in colleges, because I remember pictures of football teams I've seen, and there's crazy little uniforms they used to have and everything else. I remember, so if they shot pictures of them, they were playing. But it didn't have the universal appeal that baseball did. It was the amount of fans were much less than the baseball fans. And basketball was, I don't know, they might have had college competitions, but nobody really knew anything about them. The sports were baseball, and they had horse racing. I don't know of anything else that had a general appeal in the way of sports that was organized. There was sports that weren't organized. For example, ice skating. Whenever the rinks or lakes were frozen, everybody ice skated, and various things like that. It was just purely unorganized. There was a lot of that.
Do you remember playing hockey at all, or was that?
Well, some people played hockey, but there again, that wasn't organized either. You just get a tin can and start beating it. In fact, we'd kick the can too in the summertime, you know, just on the street. But
and marbles, did you ever get into
marbles? I was one of the best, I'll have you know. That was at Buchanan School.
middle school?
No, before middle school. This was in grade school, and I was pretty good. I was one and they didn't want to play with me too much because I usually won, and I'd get a bag full of these things, and some of the real pretty. They were glass, you know, and or agates, and so forth. Very pretty. But anyhow, I got a little aside to tell you about. There was a German kid that came to our school directly from Germany, and this is the first experience he had at school here. And he wanted to play marbles too, but he wasn't so good. He was losing to me and everybody else. But the thing is, he had a bicycle, and I didn't have a bicycle. And I loved to ride a bicycle. So I made a deal with him. I said I'd give him what I won the 5 days of school, so that on Saturday he could go down. The kids still had marble games on Saturday around the school, and so I'd give him that if he'd let me ride his bike while he was playing marbles.